Hey guys, tonight let's slow things down. Maybe dim the lights a little, put the phone face down, and let your shoulders drop. You don't need to do anything right now. You're just here to listen. And tonight we're drifting into 18th century London, a place that smells bad, sounds worse, and somehow still finds room for one extremely unnecessary man with a pin. Because, of course it does. Now, when people think of historical monsters, they imagine cloaks, fangs, maybe a tragic backstory involving a castle and too many bats. This is not that. This is much more irritating and much more British. This is the story of the so-called Monster of London, a name that sounds dramatic, but really refers to a guy who walked around poking women with sharp objects and then sprinting away like a panicked raccoon. So, let's settle in. No jump scares, no chases, just vibes, fog, paranoia, and a deeply confused city. London in the late 1700s was already doing too much. It was crowded, loud, and constantly on fire, rebuilding, or trying to remember where it put its sewage. The streets were narrow, lighting was optional, and personal safety was aspirational. This was a city where you could absolutely disappear into a crowd, or into a puddle, or into a poorly labeled alley that no one ever checked again. And into this environment stepped the monster. Around the early 1990s, women in London started reporting strange attacks. Not robberies, not murders, just sudden pain, a sharp jab, scream, and then nothing. Victims described feeling a stabbing sensation, sometimes through clothing, sometimes through dresses thick enough to double as upholstery. When they looked down, they found small puncture wounds, occasionally blood, occasionally not, and always confusion. Witnesses claimed the attacker would approach quietly, often from behind. Sometimes he would say something odd, sometimes nothing at all, then poke, and he'd vanish into the crowd, which, honestly, is the worst possible crime for public morale. Because how do you explain that to people? Don't worry, he's not killing anyone, he's just poking. Londoners did not find this reassuring. Soon, rumors started doing what rumors do best, stretching, mutating, and putting on a little weight. Some said the weapon wasn't a pin, but a knife. Others insisted it was a syringe, or poisoned needles, or blades hidden in his knees, because, obviously. One popular theory was that he injected victims with poison. Another claimed he'd stabbed women so deeply their bones were damaged, which didn't align with the medical reports, but fear is not a big fan of accuracy. Descriptions of the monster varied wildly. Tall, short, broad-shouldered, slim, wearing a cloak, wearing nothing memorable at all. Basically, he looked like a man, which was not helpful. The press, however, was thrilled. Pamphlets were printed, newspapers ran dramatic headlines, and the name Monster stuck because annoying guy with a pin doesn't sell. Women were advised to walk in groups, to carry sticks, and to stab him back just in case. Some even began wearing thicker clothing or improvised armor, which is not what fashion designers had in mind for the 1790s. There were reports of men being chased down and beaten by mobs simply for walking too close to a woman, which tells you everything you need to know about how well this was going. And then, because London is London, things escalated. Some women claimed the monster spoke to them before attacking, allegedly saying things like, "Remember me," or "I'll mark you," which sounds scripted, like he practiced in a mirror. Others reported he laughed softly, which is worse. Soon, the monster wasn't just a nuisance. He was a symbol of urban fear, of male violence, of the idea that the city itself was out of control, and all because one man absolutely refused to just not do this. The authorities predictably struggled. There were no photographs, no forensic science, just vibes and panic. Several men were arrested, most were released, some were innocent, some were probably just unlucky. At one point, a man named John Coleman was accused. He denied everything, witnesses were unsure, and eventually the case collapsed. Meanwhile, the monster continued. Or maybe he didn't. No one was entirely sure which attacks were real anymore, because once a panic starts, it feeds itself. Some attacks had no wounds at all.
Others had injuries that didn't match earlier descriptions. It became impossible to tell where the monster ended and mass hysteria began, which is very on brand for the 18th century. Eventually, a young woman named Ann Porter accused a man named Reinwick Williams. She claimed he stabbed her with a blade hidden in his knee, which is, again, creative. Williams was arrested, he denied it, and there was little physical evidence, but public pressure was intense. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. And just like that, the monster disappeared. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he was never one person. Maybe he was several. Maybe he was exaggerated. Maybe he was just one deeply bored man who discovered that fear was contagious. Historians still argue about it. Some believe Williams was innocent, others think he was guilty, but not alone, and some think the monster was largely a social phenomenon, fear layered on fear, pokes turning into legends. What matters is how easily the city accepted the idea of a monster, how quickly anxiety found a shape, and how much energy was spent on a problem that, in the end, left no clear answers, just pamphlets, trial records, and a lot of deeply uncomfortable conversations about public space and women's safety. So, as we sit here, centuries later, wrapped in blankets and modern lighting, it's oddly soothing to know that even then people were confused, authorities were overwhelmed, and someone, somewhere, was making everything worse for no reason at all. And that wasn't a man with a pin, it was fear with free time. Because once the idea of the monster settled into the city, London did what it always does best. It obsessed, slowly, endlessly, and with absolutely no chill. By the mid-1990s, the monster was less a person and more a shared anxiety. He lived in whispers, in pamphlets, in the long walk home after sunset, when every footstep behind you suddenly felt personal. Women adjusted their routines, not dramatically, just quietly. Earlier evenings, busier streets, longer routes home that felt safer, even if they weren't. Men, meanwhile, developed a new fear, being mistaken, because now any man who walked too close, too fast, or too silently could become a suspect, and London crowds were not known for their restraint. There were accounts of men being chased down, grabbed, questioned, sometimes beaten,
Sometimes just stared at aggressively until they apologized for existing, which is how you know things were spiraling. The newspapers did not help. They never do. Each new report added flourishes, sharper weapons, more sinister motives. The monster became taller, stronger, more theatrical. One paper described him as having inhuman strength. Another suggested he enjoyed the terror more than the act itself, which again sounds like something someone made up 5 minutes before deadline. Pamphlets were printed warning women of danger. Illustrations showed cloaked figures looming out of fog, always dramatic, always vague. No one ever printed a sketch labeled, "Possibly just some guy." The city also offered rewards, money for information, money for capture, money for peace of mind, which attracts a very specific type of person, the kind who suddenly remembers something suspicious they maybe saw once, or the kind who points at their neighbor and says, honestly, could be him. False accusations multiplied. Men with physical disabilities were accused. Foreigners were accused. Men who just looked odd were accused, because fear doesn't like nuance. Meanwhile, the actual attacks, or reports of them, became harder to categorize. Some women reported minor injuries consistent with pins. Others had scratches. Some had nothing at all, just the sensation of pain and terror. And that's where historians start quietly clearing their throats, because pain can be real without injury. Fear can do strange things to the body. And once a city agrees something is happening, it starts happening everywhere. There's a modern term for this: mass psychogenic illness, shared panic, collective suggestion. In the 18th century, they called it a monster. Now, this doesn't mean the original attacks weren't real. They likely were. But by this stage, the monster had outgrown his own actions. He was no longer just poking women. He was shaping behavior. He was altering daily life. And the authorities were desperate to end it. Enter Reinwick Williams, a name history remembers, but not kindly. Williams was a young man, working class,
unremarkable in most ways, which made him perfect. He was accused by Ann Porter, a woman who claimed he stabbed her while passing by. She insisted he used a blade concealed in his knee. Now, pause here just for a second. A blade in a knee? It's not impossible, but it is ambitious. Williams was arrested. Searches were conducted. No weapon was found that matched the description. No clear physical evidence linked him to previous attacks. But witnesses came forward. Sort of. Some said they recognized him. Others said he looked like the monster, which, as we've established, meant very little. The trial moved forward anyway. Public pressure was intense. London wanted closure. It wanted a face, and Williams was available. He was convicted, sentenced to 6 years in prison, later reduced, and then silence. No more attacks, no more reports. The monster vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, which sounds satisfying, too satisfying, because history doesn't wrap itself up like that. Some historians believe Williams was guilty, that he was the monster, or at least one of them, that fear ended when the cause was removed. Others believe he was innocent, that the panic simply burned itself out once people felt something had been done. And that second explanation feels very familiar, because humans like endings, even if they're fake, especially if they're fake. What's fascinating is how quickly London moved on. The pamphlets stopped, the headlines faded, the city found new things to worry about: wars, politics, bread prices, the usual. The monster became a footnote, a curiosity, a story told years later with raised eyebrows and vague memories. And yet his legacy lingered. He exposed something uncomfortable about public fear, about how easily society can build a villain, about how quickly protection turns into suspicion, and also about how little it takes to destabilize daily life. Just a pin, just a rumor, just enough uncertainty. Which brings us to a broader pattern in history, because the Monster of London wasn't unique. He was part of a long tradition of deeply underwhelming men causing wildly disproportionate panic. Men whose actions were small, but whose symbolism was enormous. And in the next part, we're going to gently drift into that pattern, not rushing, not escalating, just gliding from one unnecessary historical figure to another. By the time the Monster of London faded out of public memory, the city had already filed him away into a very specific mental drawer, the one labeled, "That was weird," anyway. And this is where history gets interesting. Not loud interesting, but soft interesting, the kind you barely notice until you're already half asleep. Because the monster wasn't really about pins or knees or even crime. He was about uncertainty. London in the late 18th century was changing fast. People were moving in. Old social rules were wobbling. Cities were getting too big for anyone to feel watched and too crowded for anyone to feel alone. And that combination makes people nervous. When communities get nervous, they start looking for something simple to blame, something with edges, something they can point at and say, "there." And if nothing obvious is available, they improvise. This is how you end up with monsters that don't quite make sense. Not wolves, not killers, just men who are unsettling. And history is full of them. So, if we gently widen the lens, across Europe, and especially in big cities, the late 1700s and early 1800s were a golden age of moral panics. People were terrified of crime, terrified of strangers, terrified of women walking alone, terrified of men walking alone near women, which is a logistical nightmare if you think about it. There were panics about poisoners, about kidnappers, about men stealing hair, about men stealing bodies, about men stealing children for vague, poorly defined purposes. Often these anxieties were rooted in real anxieties: economic pressure, urban anonymity, the loss of traditional authority. But instead of addressing those, society focused on vibes, and vibes are very persuasive. Take the monster again. What made him terrifying wasn't what he did, it was how random it felt. No motive, no pattern, no explanation that made anyone feel smarter afterward. He didn't rob, he didn't kill, he didn't even stick around. He violated expectations, and humans hate that. One of the strangest parts of the monster panic was how subtly it reshaped gendered behavior. Women were suddenly framed as both helpless victims and heroic defenders. Pamphlets encouraged them to fight back, to carry weapons, to scream, to strike first.
While at the same time they were told not to walk alone, not to provoke, not to be careless. An impossible balance, but it always has been. Men, meanwhile, were encouraged to protect and also warned not to appear threatening, to intervene but not too aggressively, to be vigilant but not suspicious. Basically, everyone was asked to be calmer than the situation allowed. And when that didn't work, people turned to spectacle. Public trials became entertainment. Crowds gathered not just for justice, but for relief, because they wanted to see fear being handled. This is why Reinwyck Williams mattered so much, not because he was proven guilty, but because he was visible. He gave fear a body, a name, a cell, and once fear has somewhere to sit down, it tends to get quieter. But the part people don't love to talk about is that the monster wasn't the last time London or any city did this. He was just early. Over the next century, cities would repeatedly latch on to singular figures to explain complex problems, compressing entire social anxieties into one conveniently shaped person. Sometimes those people were guilty, and sometimes they absolutely were not, and history rarely pauses to double-check. What makes the Monster of London especially fascinating is how non-dramatic his end was. No execution, no confession, no final reveal, just quiet, which is deeply unsatisfying if you're looking for closure, but incredibly realistic if you're looking at human behavior. Most panics don't end with truth, they end with exhaustion. People stop talking, papers move on, fear finds a new hobby, and the old panic becomes a story told later with a half smile. Do you remember when? As if it wasn't terrifying at the time. Now, if we do something very gentle and connect this to the people who usually avoid these kinds of panics, the elites, the royals, the people supposed to be insulated from urban nonsense, we find that even they weren't immune, and in fact they were often the cause. Royal courts were pressure cookers of rumor, places where boredom met paranoia and produced ideas. Courtiers accused each other constantly of poisoning, of witchcraft, of sabotage, of crimes that sounded suspiciously like whatever they'd read last. Just like the monster panic, these accusations often said more about anxiety than reality. A sick king meant someone must be responsible. A queen struggling to conceive meant obvious sabotage. A prince behaving strangely meant, well, theories. And because elites had power, their fears had consequences. People were imprisoned, exiled, executed, all because someone needed a reason. Which brings us very softly to where we're going next, because the Monster of London is a civilian version of something much older, a pattern that runs through palaces as much as alleyways, the habit of blaming individuals for systemic discomfort and the need to find a villain when reality feels too big. By the early 1800s, the Monster of London had become manageable, not solved, not explained, just quietly filed away. Newspapers stopped mentioning him, pamphlets yellowed and disappeared, and people who had once crossed the street in fear now crossed it simply because they were late. Reinwyck Williams served his sentence, was eventually released, and faded into obscurity, which is either tragic or appropriate, depending on whether one believes he was guilty. There was no official declaration that the monster had been defeated, no announcement, no parade. Governments rarely like admitting they reacted emotionally. They prefer quiet transitions, where one day there is panic and the next day there is not, and no one asks too many questions. What was left behind was something softer, a residue. It appeared in the way later writers spoke about the case, with mild embarrassment, with fascination, and with that careful tone people use when discussing something they once believed very strongly, but now don't want to examine too closely. The monster became a cautionary tale, though never officially acknowledged as such.
Unofficially, he remained a reminder that cities can scare themselves, that rumor spreads faster than reason, and that once fear is given a name, it gains authority. This is where the story loops back into the world of elites and royals, whether they like it or not. Royal history is filled with monsters that were never monsters at all, only convenient explanations. A sickly heir becomes cursed, a queen who does not produce children becomes unnatural, and a king who behaves erratically becomes possessed or corrupted. It is the same instinct with different decoration. Royal courts of the 17th and 18th centuries were deeply anxious environments, surrounded by luxury, fueled by boredom, and obsessed with lineage. When something went wrong, it could not simply be bad luck, it had to be someone's fault. Courtiers whispered, physicians blamed one another, religious advisors hinted at divine displeasure, and enemies were invented where none existed. Just like the monster of London, these fears needed faces, a servant, a rival noble, a foreign bride, someone who could absorb the anxiety so the system itself did not have to be questioned. The monster panic and royal paranoia are cousins, separated by class but driven by the same emotional mechanics, and both tend to end the same way, not with truth, but with silence. One of the most revealing aspects of the monster case is how little effort was made later to revisit it. There was no official inquiry decades later, no serious attempt to clear names. Once the fear was gone, the interest was gone, which is deeply human. History does not preserve events because they are important, it preserves them because someone kept writing. In this case, the writing stopped. What remains are fragments, trial transcripts, newspaper clippings, and second-hand accounts, enough to know something happened, but not enough to know exactly what. Perhaps that is the point. The monster of London was not a singular villain stalking foggy streets forever. He was a moment, a convergence of anxiety, urban density, gendered fear, and rumor. He serves as a reminder that sometimes the scariest thing in history is not the act itself, but how people respond to it. Women were hurt, and that matters. Fear was real, and that matters. But the way the city spiraled, accused blindly, and rushed to closure is the lasting lesson, one that repeats over and over again in royal families, in cities, and in entire nations. Fear looks for shape, and if it does not find one, it makes one. Once it does, that shape becomes difficult to unsee. The monster of London did not need to exist forever to leave a mark. He only needed a few years and a city ready to believe. Eventually, London grew, lighting improved, policing changed, and new fears replaced old ones. Jack the Ripper would come later, much later, and that story would be louder, bloodier, and more cinematic. But the monster came first, quieter, stranger, and more awkward, a rehearsal panic, and in some ways more revealing. There was no mystery to solve, no clever twist, just a city uneasy with itself, reacting to the feeling that something was wrong. That's how most historical disasters actually begin, not with monsters, but with nerves. And that's where we leave it. We're talking about the forgotten female gladiators of the Roman arena. Women who absolutely existed, who absolutely fought, and who Rome spent centuries pretending were just a strange rumor everyone somehow imagined, which is very on brand for Rome. This takes us back to a civilization that built aqueducts, conquered half the known world, and then became deeply uncomfortable when women picked up swords. When most people picture a Roman gladiator, they imagine a sweaty, oiled-up man in an impractical helmet, sand underfoot, a roaring crowd, and possibly a lion nearby, even when it makes no sense. What people do not imagine is a woman, largely because Roman history has a habit of saying that didn't really happen whenever women do anything interesting. But female gladiators were real. They even had a name, gladiatrices, essentially gladiator, with Rome awkwardly adding an ending and then panicking about the implications. They were never common, never celebrated, and were never supposed to exist at all, which is exactly what makes them fascinating. To understand why their existence caused so much discomfort, you have to understand how Romans felt about women in general, which is complicated but mostly bad. Roman women were expected to be quiet, modest, fertile, and indoors, ideally all at once. Their purpose was to produce heirs, manage households, and avoid embarrassing men. Public life, politics, violence, and especially sweating half naked in front of crowds were firmly considered male territory. So when a woman entered the arena, it wasn't just entertainment, it was social heresy. It made Rome's carefully stacked gender rules wobble, and Rome hated wobbling. At the same time, Rome loved novelty, spectacle, and money, so female gladiators existed anyway. The earliest references to women fighting in arenas appear in the 1st century AD, not in heroic poems or proud inscriptions, but in side comments, complaints, and moral lectures, which is usually how historians know something absolutely happened. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius mention women participating in gladiatorial games as part of extravagant spectacles staged by emperors who had exhausted more conventional ideas. Nero, predictably, was involved. If something was excessive, shocking, or morally questionable, Nero was usually nearby. He reportedly had women of noble birth fighting in the arena, not because it was traditional, but because it scandalized people. Romans enjoyed being shocked as long as they could complain about it afterward. These women weren't always desperate slaves forced into combat. Some came from elite families, which made the situation far worse in Roman eyes. A poor woman fighting was uncomfortable, but a wealthy woman fighting was unacceptable, because it threatened the idea that social order was fragile and dependent on women staying in their place. Most female gladiators, however, were slaves, former slaves, or women already living on the margins of society. Women who didn't fit neatly into Roman ideals and were already labeled improper or unfeminine. Putting them in the arena served as both entertainment and punishment. They trained like male gladiators, lived in gladiator schools, and learned specific fighting styles with specific weapons. Still, their presence was always treated as a novelty act, a reminder to the audience that what they were watching was unusual and transgressive. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from a relief discovered in Halicarnassus, depicting 2 female gladiators facing each other. They're identified by stage names, Amazon and Achillea, because even in combat, women weren't allowed to simply be themselves. They had to become mythological. They're shown bareheaded, wearing protective gear, armed, balanced, and professional. The inscription tells us their fight ended in missio, meaning both were spared. There was no dramatic death, just 2 women who fought well enough to earn mercy from the crowd and the organizer. That detail matters because it suggests they weren't jokes or gimmicks, they were competent, and that competence made Rome uneasy. Roman writers described female gladiators with open disdain, focusing on their lack of femininity and framing their existence as proof of moral decay. Juvenal, Rome's most dedicated complainer, mocked elite women who trained with weapons, describing them sweating and humiliating their husbands. This reaction reveals more about Roman anxiety than about the women themselves. Female gladiators forced Romans to confront the uncomfortable reality that gender roles were not as solid as they pretended, and nothing exposed that faster than a woman holding a sword while a crowd cheered. Eventually, Rome tried to shut it down. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus banned female gladiators, not out of progressivism, but because the novelty had faded and the moral panic had grown. Women in the arena were no longer shocking in an entertaining way. They were shocking in a way that suggested loss of control. So Rome banned the practice and then did what it did best, pretended it never happened. Female gladiators vanished from official records, surviving only in fragments, complaints, carvings, and dismissive comments by irritated men. For centuries, historians followed Rome's lead, minimizing these women, questioning their existence, and labeling them as rare anomalies because it was easier that way. But the arena doesn't lie. Women fought, trained, and stood before thousands of spectators, surviving long enough to earn mercy. They were never myths, just inconvenient truths, and Rome was exceptionally good at forgetting inconvenient women. If you nodded off for a moment, that's perfect. That means it's working. Last time, we drifted into the Roman arena and quietly acknowledged that women were there, sword in hand, sand underfoot, making senators extremely uncomfortable. So now, let's slow things down even more and talk about what life actually looked like for a female gladiator, because it wasn't all dramatic entrances and crowd reactions. Most of it was routine, repetitive, and oddly bureaucratic, which is exactly how Rome liked its violence. Female gladiators trained in the same places as men, the ludus, which was a gym, part prison, part human inventory warehouse. These were enclosed schools run by a lanista, a man whose job title basically meant professional owner of fighters, and yes, he owned them. Most gladiators were slaves, condemned criminals, or people who had signed contracts out of desperation, and female gladiators fell into the same categories. Some were enslaved women sold into gladiatorial schools, some were freed women trying to survive, and some, rarely, were volunteers. That always confuses people. Why would anyone volunteer for this? And the answer is the same as always: money, fame, and the slim, bare chance of survival.
Fragile hope of independence in a society that offered women very little of it. Once inside the ludus, gender mattered less than skill, which sounds progressive but was really just practical, because a sword doesn't care who's holding it. Women trained with wooden weapons first, heavy ones, heavier than the real thing, because Rome believed in suffering now to avoid embarrassment later. They practiced footwork, balance, endurance, they sparred, they fell, they got up again, and they did all of this under constant supervision because Rome trusted no one, ever. Female gladiators were often trained to fight other women. Not always, but usually, because the idea of mixed gender fights made Roman elites deeply nervous, not because of fairness, but because of symbolism. A man losing to a woman in public would shatter too many illusions, and Rome ran on illusions. So women were paired together, given styles, assigned personas, and this is where stage names come in. Real names didn't matter much in the arena. What mattered was branding. So female gladiators were given names pulled from mythology like Amazon, Achillea, and Penthesilea. Names that made them feel distant, legendary, less real, because it's easier to watch violence when the person doesn't feel like a normal human being. Their armor was similar to men's but often lighter, sometimes more decorative, not because Rome cared about aesthetics, but because novelty sold tickets. Women fought bareheaded more often than men, which was dangerous but visually distinctive, and Rome loved visuals. Their bodies were scrutinized constantly, not just for strength but for femininity. Too soft and they weren't believable fighters, too muscular and they were mocked as unfeminine, so there was no winning. And honestly, that part hasn't changed much. Outside the ludus, Roman society didn't know what to do with these women. They weren't respectable, they weren't entirely dishonorable either. They existed in an uncomfortable in-between. Gladiators were famous, crowds loved them, fans carved graffiti praising them, women wore amulets with gladiators' names, and yes, this included female gladiators.
There's evidence that people found them fascinating, attractive, exotic, which made Roman moralists furious, because nothing enraged a Roman writer faster than women being admired for the wrong reasons. Female gladiator bouts were rare but carefully staged, usually appearing as special attractions during games hosted by emperors or wealthy sponsors, basically bonus content after the animal hunts, executions, and male gladiators. The fights weren't necessarily less serious. They followed the same rules. Referees watched closely. Weapons were chosen for balance, not chaos. And despite modern assumptions, gladiator fights weren't constant bloodbaths. They were controlled because expensive fighters were valuable and you didn't just kill them for fun. So, female gladiators, like men, could survive multiple bouts, and some probably built modest careers, which is wild to think about. A woman in ancient Rome, known primarily for her combat skill, recognized, cheered, and then returning to a cell to sleep, eat, and do it again. This is where Rome's hypocrisy really shines, because the same society that condemned women for fighting also fetishized them endlessly. Female gladiators appeared in art, on lamps, in small figurines, eroticized and exoticized because Rome couldn't decide whether to be offended or intrigued, so it chose both. Women who survived long enough might earn freedom, just like men, symbolized by a wooden sword, a rudis, and after that we don't really know because records go quiet. Did they marry, disappear into obscurity, train others? Rome didn't care to record it, because once a woman stopped being useful as a spectacle, she stopped existing historically, which is maybe the most Roman thing of all. By the late 2nd century, female gladiators were becoming more visible, and that visibility made elites anxious. The empire was changing, social norms felt unstable, too many people were crossing boundaries, so Septimius Severus banned women from the arena firmly. And just like that, an entire category of fighters vanished, or at least vanished from official approval. History loves to pretend bans erase things completely, but they don't. They just push them into silence, and silence is where women tend to get left behind. Still, traces remain, in carvings, in offhand remarks, in laws written specifically to stop something from happening. Because laws are admissions, and Rome accidentally admitted that women were fighting, that people were watching, and that it bothered them enough to intervene, which means it mattered. So, as you settle deeper into the background hum of history, remember this. Female gladiators weren't myths, they weren't mistakes, they weren't jokes. They were trained professionals navigating a brutal system that didn't know what to do with them, and Rome, in all its marble confidence, blinked first. Ancient Rome works best when it's slightly out of focus. So far, we've met the women who trained, fought, and survived in the Roman arena, not loudly, not heroically, just steadily, under rules designed for men who never expected to share the sand. Now comes the truly Roman part of the story, what happened after. Because the empire didn't collapse the moment women picked up swords, life went on. Emperors changed, bans were issued, and then the narrative shifted. Rome didn't just stop female gladiators, it slowly erased them. And the erasure wasn't dramatic. No book burning, no official announcement saying, by the way, we regret everything. It was quieter than that, which is always how it works. Once female gladiators were banned, references to them became inconvenient. They no longer fit the story Rome wanted to tell about itself, so writers stopped mentioning them. Or when they did, they framed them as decadent curiosities, symptoms of moral decline, mistakes made during unstable times, basically history's version of let's not dwell on that. Roman historians loved patterns, golden ages, moral decay, restoration. Women in armor didn't fit neatly into any of that.
So they were folded into footnotes, side remarks, parenthetical disapprovals. And when Rome fell, things didn't improve. Medieval writers inherited Roman texts and Roman biases, They were already suspicious of women, already deeply invested in fixed gender roles, so when they encountered vague references to female fighters, they shrugged, reinterpreted them, or ignored them completely. Because obviously women didn't fight in arenas, except they did. But history is not built on what happened, it's built on what people bothered to copy. And for centuries, no one bothered to copy the women. Even when archaeology started filling in the gaps, scholars resisted. The Halicarnassus relief, for example, sat quietly for years. Two armed women, names carved clearly, and yet early interpretations tried desperately to make them anything else. Athletes, performers, mythological figures, anything but gladiators. Because admitting they were gladiators meant admitting something uncomfortable about Rome and about ourselves. Modern historians weren't immune either. For a long time, female gladiators were treated as novelties, rare exceptions, curiosities that didn't really count, which is a polite way of saying we don't know where to put them. The idea that women could train, fight, and survive within Rome's most masculine institution challenged too many assumptions, so scholars minimized them and audiences followed suit. Pop culture didn't help either. When gladiators appeared in movies, women were either love interests or background decoration, occasionally a warrior princess, but never just another fighter, because that would feel too normal, and normal women with swords apparently make people nervous. But here's the thing. The more we look, the more evidence appears. Gravestones, graffiti, legal texts, even bans themselves. You don't ban something that doesn't exist. You don't complain about something no one is doing. Every angry Roman moralist was accidentally preserving proof. They couldn't help it. Their outrage became the record, which is kind of poetic. Now, let's gently shift perspective. Imagine being a female gladiator near the end of the 2nd century. You've trained, you've fought, you've survived, and suddenly the door closes. No more fights, no more arena, not because you failed, but because society changed its mind. What happens to you? There's no guidebook for that. Some women may have been released, some reassigned, some forgotten. A few might have lived long enough to become rumors, stories whispered, half remembered, and then silence. That silence lasted a very long time. Centuries of historians repeating each other, centuries of assumptions calcifying into fact, until finally, slowly, people started asking different questions. Why would Rome invent female gladiators just to complain about them? Why depict them in art? Why legislate against them? Why name them? History usually doesn't invent specific women unless it has to, and that realization has been quietly reshaping the field. Today, female gladiators are no longer dismissed outright. They're accepted as rare but real, which is progress, slow, sleepy, very on theme, but it also forces us to rethink what the Roman arena really was. It wasn't just a masculine proving ground, it was a performance space, a place where boundaries could be tested, bent, and occasionally broken, and women were part of that, not celebrated, not empowered in a modern sense, but present, and presence matters. Because once you accept that women were there, you start seeing them elsewhere too, in military camps, in workshops, in trade. History opens up, and it becomes less tidy, less comfortable, which is probably why it took so long. So as you relax into the rhythm of this story, remember this: for every woman Rome erased, there were dozens who lived ordinary, undocumented lives. Female gladiators stand out not because they were the only women doing difficult things, but because Rome accidentally left the door open just long enough for us to see them. In the next part, we'll gently widen the lens even further. We'll look at how these women were remembered, misremembered, and quietly recycled into myth and fantasy, not with drama, not with fanfare.
By now, the female gladiators of Rome are no longer standing in the arena. They're standing in the margins, in footnotes, in academic debates, in awkward silences where certainty used to be. And this is where their story slowly dissolves into something softer, stranger, and more familiar: myth. Once Rome erased the real women, it didn't leave the space empty. It rarely does. Instead, the idea of women who fought was recycled, diluted, repackaged. Amazon warriors, exotic foreigners, fantasy figures who existed somewhere else, long ago, or not quite like that. Because fictional women with swords are safe, real ones are complicated. The Romans themselves helped with this transformation. They loved borrowing from Greek myth, especially when it let them keep reality at arm's length. Calling a gladiator Amazon wasn't just dramatic flair, it was a distancing tactic, a way of saying, this isn't a normal woman, this is something else, something mythic, something unreal. And once something becomes unreal, it can be controlled. As centuries passed, the memory of female gladiators blurred into legend. Medieval writers absorbed the myths but ignored the evidence. Renaissance scholars admired Rome but filtered it through their own biases. Female warriors became symbols, allegories, decorations, not people. Even when archaeology dragged their existence back into the light, the discomfort lingered. Because accepting female gladiators means accepting that ancient societies were messier than we like to admit, that gender roles were enforced, yes, but constantly tested, that power didn't flow neatly in one direction, and that women, even under extreme limitation, found ways to exist outside the script. Which brings us to a quiet but important realization. Female gladiators weren't rebels in the modern sense. They weren't activists. They weren't trying to dismantle patriarchy. They were surviving. They were navigating a brutal system with the tools available to them. Some were forced. Some volunteered. Some likely hated every moment. Some may have found strange forms of agency within it. And all of that can be true at the same time. History often wants clean heroes and villains, but the arena doesn't provide that. It provides people, and Rome was very good at using people up. One of the strangest things about female gladiators is how briefly they appear, historically speaking. A flash, a few decades of evidence, and then silence. But that doesn't mean they were insignificant. In fact, their short visibility tells us something important about Rome itself.
The empire tolerated women in the arena as long as it served spectacle. Once the shock faded, once the novelty wore thin, once the discomfort outweighed the entertainment, Rome shut it down. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was destabilizing. Women fighting challenged the visual language of power, and Rome understood visuals better than almost anyone, so it rewrote the image. Strong men, passive women. Order restored, at least on the surface. Underneath, of course, nothing was ever that simple. Women continued to train, to work, to fight in other ways, just not where Rome had to acknowledge them. And that pattern, brief visibility followed by long erasure, is not unique to female gladiators. It happens over and over again, in different cultures, different eras. People appear in the record only when they disrupt something, and then vanish once order reasserts itself. Which makes the female gladiators of Rome oddly familiar. They're not just a curiosity. They're a reminder of how history filters reality. What gets remembered isn't always what mattered most. It's what made the people writing uncomfortable enough to mention it. And that's why their story still feels unfinished. Because Rome never wrote an ending. There's no grand farewell, no last recorded fight, no aging gladiatrix reminiscing about the sand. Just a law, a ban, and then absence. So we're left to imagine the rest.
A woman who once fought under a stage name, now walking anonymously through a market. Someone who trained her body for combat, now told to disappear quietly. Someone whose scars meant everything in one context and nothing in another. And maybe that's the most honest ending possible. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just unresolved. Which fits history better than we like to admit. The forgotten female gladiators of the Roman arena don't need embellishment. They don't need to be turned into legends. They were already interesting enough. They lived in a system designed to limit them and still found themselves standing in the most public, violent space Rome had to offer. They weren't supposed to be there, and for a while they were anyway. And that quiet fact, barely recorded, reluctantly acknowledged, is what lingers, not as a roar from the crowd, but as a low, steady presence beneath the stories Rome preferred to tell. And that's where we leave them. Not erased, not mythologized, just remembered. We're drifting into one of those historical rabbit holes that feels quiet, slow, and slightly confusing in a very Victorian way. A story about young girls, anxious parents, doctors with mustaches, newspapers with no chill, and a century that desperately wanted miracles, but also loved accusing people of lying. This is the strange, sad, and very sleepy story of the 19th century fasting girls. Children who claimed, sometimes sincerely, sometimes not, to live without food. No bread, no broth, no tea biscuits, just vibes. And of course, people believed them because it was the 1800s, and believing weird things was kind of their brand. So let's begin. In the early to mid-19th century, Europe, and especially Britain, was in a strange emotional place. Industrialization was loud, cities were crowded, religion was wobbling slightly, and science was trying to explain things, but still wore top hats while doing it. And in that anxious atmosphere, stories began circulating of girls who simply stopped eating. Not dieting, not fasting for Lent, not skipping meals because they were busy, just allegedly surviving for months, then years, then entire childhoods, and somehow still lying in bed looking pale, holy, and mildly inconvenienced. These girls were usually young, often preteen or teenage, almost always from poor or rural families, and frequently described as delicate, fragile, and spiritually inclined, which is Victorian code for she doesn't talk back and looks faint a lot. The first thing to understand is that fast-in girls weren't originally treated as medical mysteries, they were treated as religious events. In a deeply Christian society, not eating wasn't automatically a disorder, it was a signal. If a girl could live without food, then clearly God was involved, or angels, or at least a very committed saint on a lunch break. Parents didn't rush to hospitals, they invited pastors. Neighbors came to pray, newspapers showed up with notebooks and opinions, and the girls mostly stayed in bed, because once you stop eating, lying down becomes kind of your main activity. One of the earliest and most famous cases came from Wales, because of course it did. Wales in the 1800s was basically a factory for religious intensity. Her name was Sarah Jacob. Born in 1857, Sarah was described as a sweet, quiet child who began experiencing seizures around the age of 9, and after one particularly dramatic episode, she reportedly stopped eating. At first, it was a few days, then weeks, then months. Her parents claimed she consumed nothing, no food, no drink, not even water, which, if you know anything about biology, is a bold claim, a very bold claim. But instead of questioning this, local ministers leaned in hard. They declared Sarah a miracle, a sign from God, a living example of divine intervention in an increasingly industrial world. Pilgrims began visiting the family's cottage. They prayed, they stared, they sometimes paid, because miracles are more impressive if you can charge admission. Sarah, meanwhile, lay in bed, quiet, still, barely speaking, which, to be fair, is what happens when adults turn your childhood into a theological conference. Doctors eventually got involved, because doctors always arrive late to these stories like,
Hey, so have we considered food? The medical community was skeptical. They suggested Sarah must be eating secretly, perhaps at night, perhaps with the help of her parents. The parents were offended, deeply, because accusing someone of feeding their child is apparently very rude when God is involved. So to settle the matter, a decision was made, and it was not great. Sarah would be watched constantly, day and night, no food allowed. A rotating team of nurses monitored her. No one left her alone, no crumbs, no sips. And here's where the story stops being quaint and becomes quietly tragic, because Sarah didn't eat. After a few days, she weakened. After a few more, she deteriorated. And after about 2 weeks, she died. She was 12. The coroner ruled it starvation, which feels obvious in hindsight. Her parents were convicted of manslaughter, the miracle evaporated, and the newspapers moved on to the next strange thing. But instead of ending the phenomenon, Sarah Jacob became a blueprint, because the idea of the fasting girl didn't die with her, it multiplied. Throughout the 19th century, similar cases popped up across Britain, France, Germany, and even the United States. Girls who stopped eating, families who swore it was real, doctors who rolled their eyes, newspapers who printed everything anyway. One such girl was Molly Fancher, known as the Brooklyn Enigma, which is a strong nickname for someone who mostly stayed in bed. Molly was born in 1848 in New York, and as a teenager, she reportedly suffered a streetcar accident. After that, her health declined. She developed paralysis, blindness, seizures, and eventually an inability to eat. Her family claimed Molly survived for years. Doctors disagreed, but Molly became famous anyway. People visited her bedside, she gave interviews from bed, clergy praised her spirituality, scientists argued about metabolism, and Molly herself stayed very still. Unlike Sarah Jacob, Molly lived for decades, which already tells us something important, because people don't actually survive without food for 30 years. So what was happening? Well, probably several things. Some fasting girls were being secretly fed by parents, by siblings, by sympathetic visitors who thought slipping a spoonful of broth was an act of mercy. Some girls ate when unobserved, at night, in small amounts, just enough to survive. And some girls had eating disorders, but the Victorians didn't have language for that yet. They didn't have anorexia nervosa until the late 1870s. Before that, refusal to eat was either religious devotion or moral weakness. And because these girls were young, female, and quiet, they were rarely accused of manipulation. They were sanctified, which is not helpful.
There's also something else going on here, something quieter. In the 19th century, young girls had very little control over their lives, their bodies, their futures, but refusing food was control. It was one of the only decisions they could make that adults had to notice, and once people noticed, things spiraled. A girl who skipped meals became a girl who couldn't eat, then a girl who didn't need food, then a girl who was holy, and once that label stuck, backing out was nearly impossible. Imagine being 12, lying in bed, surrounded by adults whispering about God and miracles, and realizing that if you eat, you disappoint everyone. So you don't. Doctors began writing papers about fasting girls. They debated metabolism. They argued whether hysteria was involved, because hysteria was always involved, apparently. Some doctors proposed that girls absorbed nutrients through the air. Others suggested the body could survive on prayer, which is not how bodies work, but again, top hats. By the late 19th century, skepticism finally gained ground. Doctors began insisting on observation, controlled environments, actual evidence, and once that happened, miracles stopped happening. When watched carefully, fasting girls weakened, collapsed, or quietly began eating again. The phenomenon faded not because it was solved, but because society changed. Religion loosened its grip, medicine became louder, and young girls were slowly allowed to exist without being symbols. But the damage lingered. The fasting girls weren't fraudsters in the modern sense. They weren't con artists with press agents. They were children, often sick,
often anxious, often desperate for attention or control in a world that gave them neither. And history remembers them as curiosities, as footnotes, as mysteries, which feels incomplete, because behind every miracle headline was a bedroom, a thin child, a family overwhelmed by belief, and a society that preferred wonder over care. So as we drift toward the next set of girls, because yes, there are more, just keep that image in mind. A quiet room, a watching crowd, and a child who learned that not eating made her matter. Let's gently float forward to the later Victorian years, where the fasting girls become slightly more famous, slightly more scrutinized, and somehow even more tired. By the mid to late 19th century, the fasting girl phenomenon had become familiar, not common exactly, but recognizable. When a newspaper headline claimed, "Young girl has eaten nothing for 3 years," people no longer gasped. They sighed, poured tea, and thought, "Oh, one of those again." By this point, fasting girls were no longer just religious curiosities, they were cultural events. Doctors argued, clergy hedged, journalists sharpened their pencils, and the girls themselves stayed right where they always were, in bed. One of the most revealing aspects of the later fasting girl cases is how crowded they became. Earlier cases were local miracles. Now they were national debates. Everyone wanted access, everyone wanted proof, and everyone wanted to be the one who finally explained what was going on. Take Anne Moore, often called the fasting woman of Tutbury, though she began as a girl and simply aged into the role, which is already odd. Anne claimed to have eaten nothing since 1807, first surviving on water and later on nothing at all. Doctors were skeptical, but crowds believed her. People traveled to see her, touched her hands, asked questions, and left donations. Anne became, unintentionally or not, a small local economy. Eventually, medical professionals insisted on observation and arranged for Anne to be watched continuously. And just like with Sarah Jacob, when the watching started, the fasting stopped. Anne weakened rapidly and within days was begging for food. The miracle collapsed, public opinion turned, doctors declared fraud, and Anne was humiliated. She lived afterwards, but the attention vanished. This highlights something important. These girls, and women, were rarely prepared for what happened after disbelief arrived. There was no support, no apology, no gentle off-ramp. One day you're a wonder, the next you're a liar, and both roles are exhausting. By the 1870s and 1880s, medical thinking had evolved just enough to start circling the truth without fully landing on it. Doctors began using terms like nervous disorders, talked about hysteria, and hinted at psychological causes, still wrong, but closer. They also noticed patterns. Fasting girls were almost always female, almost always young, almost always described as obedient, sensitive, and emotionally fragile, and almost always surrounded by adults who benefited, emotionally or financially, from the situation continuing. Doctors didn't like saying that part out loud. Another famous case was Teresa Newman, slightly later and stretching into the early 20th century, but spiritually very Victorian. Teresa claimed not only to live without food, but also to bleed spontaneously from stigmata wounds, which honestly feels like stacking miracles at that point. She became internationally famous. Pilgrims visited, the church investigated, and doctors watched. And once again, when supervision tightened, the miracles became harder to demonstrate. Food appeared, blood became less convenient. Still, belief lingered because belief is stubborn. What's especially strange is how often male authorities controlled these stories while the girls themselves faded into silence. Interviews rarely quoted the girls directly. Parents spoke, doctors wrote papers, priests issued statements. The fasting girl became more object than person. And in a society that already preferred women to be quiet, thin, and passive, this fit disturbingly well. There's also the issue of Victorian beauty standards. Thinness was praised, delicacy was idealized, and a girl who took up less space was considered virtuous. So a girl who ate nothing was practically angelic. The idea that she might be suffering didn't fit the narrative.
By the time anorexia nervosa was formally named by Sir William Gull in 1873, the fasting girl had already carved out a strange cultural niche. Doctors now had language for what they were seeing, but public imagination lagged behind. Newspapers still preferred miracles to diagnoses because miracles sold better. Even when doctors explained that starvation could suppress hunger signals, people nodded politely and then went right back to believing in divine nourishment, which is very human. Some fasting girls likely believed their own stories. Starvation does strange things to the brain: hallucinations, euphoria, distorted self-perception. After long periods without food, hunger doesn't roar, it whispers and then disappears. Once that happens, the line between "I can't eat" and "I don't need to eat" blurs. Others likely felt trapped. Imagine being 15, your parents telling everyone you haven't eaten in months, visitors bringing gifts, clergy praising you. How do you say, "Actually, I had soup last night"? You don't, so you commit. You lie still, perform weakness, avoid food in public, and gradually the performance becomes your life. This is where the phenomenon turns quietly cruel, because the fasting girl was rewarded for disappearing. The thinner she became, the more attention she received. The weaker she appeared, the more important she was. Health was boring. Illness was sacred. By the end of the 19th century, skepticism finally outweighed fascination. Hospitals replaced bedrooms, doctors replaced priests, and medical journals replaced pamphlets. The fasting girl faded into a diagnosis, but she didn't vanish entirely. Her legacy lives on in how society still treats young women's bodies, still praises restraint, still romanticizes fragility, and still struggles to tell the difference between control and harm. The Victorian fasting girls weren't anomalies, they were early warning signs, and they paid for it quietly. As we drift onward, the phenomenon begins to thin out, but the ideas behind it don't. Next, we'll look at how the fasting girl quietly evolved into something more clinical, more modern, and somehow still misunderstood. By the time the 19th century comes to an end, the fasting girl is exhausted, not only physically, but culturally as well. She has been prayed over, argued about, measured, watched, accused, canonized, and quietly starved, and society is finally beginning to sense that this was never really a miracle problem at all, but a human one. Doctors, now armed with clipboards instead of sermons, began reframing the phenomenon not as divine intervention and not as fraud, but as illness. It sounded compassionate, and sometimes it was, but Victorian medicine, for all its confidence, was still deeply strange. When anorexia nervosa entered the medical vocabulary, it arrived with authority. Sir William Gull described it as a condition marked by self-starvation, mostly in young women and often linked to emotional distress. That part was reasonable. What followed was less so. Doctors blamed vanity, moral weakness, excessive imagination, and female nerves, their favorite explanation for nearly everything. The fasting girl was no longer holy, she was hysterical. With that shift, control moved again. Where priests once decided what happened behind closed doors, doctors now took charge. Food was forced, patients were isolated, family contact was restricted, and the tone changed from reverence to correction. Some girls improved and some did not, but one thing stayed consistent. The girl herself was rarely allowed to speak. Even as medicine modernized, the focus remained on managing behavior rather than understanding experience. Yet something subtle changed. New cases stopped being celebrated, newspapers stopped romanticizing them, miracle headlines faded, and once the phenomenon became diagnosable, it lost its magic, and the public lost interest. This was both a relief and a tragedy. The girls who followed were no longer displayed, but institutionalized. They had nurses instead of crowds, case studies instead of pilgrimages, and while some harm was prevented, their stories were quietly erased. The fasting girl did not disappear, she simply went indoors. In late 19th century asylum records, familiar patterns appear again and again. Young women admitted for refusing to eat, for weakness, melancholy, and an obsession with control. The language changed, but the experience did not.
Many came from restrictive households, strict religious environments, and lives shaped by high expectations and limited autonomy. Refusing food remained a language, a quiet protest, a way to say no when saying no was not permitted. The difference was that what had once been called holy was now labeled pathological, a label that still avoided the larger question of why so many girls chose this particular form of control. Victorian society never truly answered that question because the answer pointed outward, towards rigid gender roles, emotional repression, and a culture that praised self-denial above all else. The fasting girl had simply taken that lesson to its logical extreme, and that made people uncomfortable. So she was labeled, contained, and eventually forgotten. By the early 20th century, fasting girls appeared only in medical histories. The age of public miracles had ended. Science grew louder, religion quieter, and new anxieties replaced old ones. But the underlying struggle, young people grappling with control, identity, and expectation, never disappeared. It only changed costumes. What makes the fasting girl unsettling even now is how calmly the harm unfolded. There was no chaos, no rebellion, no screaming, only stillness. A child lying quietly in bed while adults argued over what her body meant. Perhaps that is why these stories feel so heavy even when told softly. Nothing explodes, nothing resolves cleanly. It simply fades, which is exactly how the phenomenon ended. No grand conclusion, no final case, just fewer articles, fewer visitors, and eventually, silence.
The fasting girls slipped out of public consciousness the same way they lived in it, quietly, passively, and misunderstood. Yet they matter, not because they were miracles or because they deceived anyone, but because they reveal something timeless. When a society refuses to listen to its children, especially its daughters, those children find other ways to speak, through silence, through disappearance, and sometimes through starvation. History often calls that mysterious instead of painful, and so the story lingers not to shock or excite, but to remain. A quiet room, a still body, and a world trying very hard not to ask why. By the time the fasting girl finally slipped out of public attention, nobody really noticed it happening. There was no announcement, no final case that wrapped everything up neatly, no official declaration that said, "All right, everyone, we've figured this out." It just stopped being interesting. And in history, when something stops being interesting, it usually hasn't been solved, it's just been absorbed. By the early 20th century, newspapers had new obsessions: wars, technology, political scandals, actual explosions, and a girl lying quietly in bed refusing food no longer competed for attention, which, depending on how you look at it, was either progress or abandonment. Medical journals still mentioned cases, and hospitals still treated patients who refused to eat, but the language was colder now, more efficient and less theatrical. No one called them miracles anymore. No one brought pilgrims or lit candles. They brought scales and charts and rules. The fasting girl, as a cultural figure, dissolved, but the conditions that created her didn't, because while Victorian religion loosened its grip, social pressure didn't vanish. It just changed shape. Girls were still expected to be compliant, still praised for restraint, still encouraged to take up as little space as possible, physically, emotionally, socially, and refusing food remained one of the quietest, most effective ways to express distress in a world that punished noise. What's uncomfortable when you sit with these stories long enough is how rarely anyone asked the girls what they felt. Not what they claimed, not what their parents believed, not what doctors diagnosed, but what they actually experienced. Were they hungry? Were they scared? Were they lonely? Those questions barely appear in the records. Instead, history is filled with debates about truth. Were they lying? Were they delusional? Were they holy? Were they hysterical? But truth, in this case, wasn't binary. Some fasting girls exaggerated, some were coerced, some believed wholeheartedly, some were quietly desperate, and many were all of those things at once. The Victorian world wasn't equipped to handle that kind of complexity. It preferred labels: saint, fraud, patient, pick one. And once chosen,
It stuck. If you read enough of these accounts, a pattern emerges that's hard to ignore. The more a girl disappeared, the weaker she became, the less she ate, the quieter she was, the more seriously she was taken. Health didn't inspire awe, suffering did. And that's the part that lingers. Because even after the fasting girls vanished from headlines, the logic remained embedded in culture. Pain equals significance, endurance equals virtue, silence equals strength. The fasting girl wasn't just a historical oddity, she was a symptom, a mirror held up to a society that admired self-denial so much it couldn't recognize self-destruction when it arrived quietly and politely. And the tragedy is that when the belief system finally collapsed, the girls were left holding the consequences. Sarah Jacob died. Others lived long lives marked by illness, scrutiny, and shame. Some disappeared into institutions, their names lost to records and handwriting, and history moved on without checking whether they landed safely. It's tempting from a modern distance to laugh gently at the absurdity. Doctors arguing about air nutrition, clergy insisting prayer could replace bread, newspapers breathlessly reporting that someone hadn't eaten in 10 years. And yes, there's irony there, plenty of it, but underneath the absurdity is something much quieter, a pattern of adults projecting meaning onto children's bodies, turning distress into spectacle and illness into identity. The fasting girls didn't ask to become symbols. They became symbols because adults needed them to be, needed proof that God still intervened, or that science was advancing, or that discipline was admirable. And once that need faded, so did the attention. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable ending, not a moral lesson or a neat conclusion, just absence. The bedrooms emptied, the crowds stopped coming, the pamphlets gathered dust, and the fasting girl, the girl who once mattered so much she was watched every second, became invisible again, only this time without the mythology. What remains now is the record, medical notes, newspaper clippings, court transcripts, fragments of lives reduced to arguments. And if you read them slowly, without looking for miracles or frauds, something else becomes visible. These were not stories about not eating. They were stories about being unheard, about control in a world that offered very little of it, about worth measured through suffering, about how easily concern turns into pressure and pressure turns into harm. The 19th century fasting girls didn't invent these dynamics, they just revealed them. And once revealed, society did what it often does best. It changed the name, adjusted the setting, and carried on. So the story ends not with resolution, but with continuity. The fasting girl doesn't vanish, she echoes in later diagnoses, in quieter struggles, in the ongoing tension between care and control. History rarely closes its loops cleanly. It prefers to drift, to blur, to leave us with questions instead of conclusions. And this story, slow, strange, and deeply human, does exactly that. No miracle, no villain, just a long silence where a voice should have been.
We're drifting gently into one of history's most stubborn myths, one that refuses to die, one that shows up in documentaries, memes, Reddit arguments, and late-night conversations with people who are very confident and also very wrong. The Library of Alexandria. You've heard the line before. The Library of Alexandria burned down and humanity lost all its knowledge. It's a great sentence. It's dramatic. It sounds tragic. It makes us feel like we're living in the ruins of something smarter. And unfortunately, it's mostly nonsense. So let's slowly, quietly, and without raising our voices, take this myth apart. Not violently, not excitingly, just gently, like removing ancient dusty stickers from a very old piece of furniture. And as we do, we'll meet some deeply stressed Greek kings, a few indifferent Roman emperors, some annoyed Christian bishops, and a lot of librarians who were honestly just trying to do their jobs. Now, before we even get to the burning, we need to talk about what the Library of Alexandria actually was. Because it wasn't one building, it wasn't one moment, And it definitely wasn't a single tragic fire where everything went whoosh and knowledge vanished forever. That version exists mostly because humans love clean endings, and history, unfortunately, does not. So let's rewind, very slowly, back to the early 3rd century BCE, Alexandria, Egypt. At this point, Alexandria is brand new, fresh city, planned grid, wide streets, Mediterranean breeze, founded by Alexander the Great, who of course died immediately afterward, because that's how Alexander the Great operates. After his death, his generals carved up the empire like tired people splitting leftovers. Egypt went to Ptolemy, yes, that Ptolemy, founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Greek rulers in Egypt who spoke Greek, married their siblings, and pretended very hard to be pharaohs. The Ptolemies wanted Alexandria to be impressive, not just rich, not just powerful, but intellectually intimidating. They wanted people to walk in and think, oh, these people are smarter than us. I should feel insecure. And that's where the library comes in. The Library of Alexandria was part of a larger institution called the Mouseion, which literally means place of the muses. So imagine less Hogwarts library and more ancient Greek academic campus. There were scholars, researchers, poets, astronomers, mathematicians, people arguing about grammar with the confidence of men who have never done manual labor. The library wasn't just shelves. It was a research center, a state-funded intellectual factory, and the goal was simple, unhinged, and extremely on brand for Hellenistic kings. They wanted every book in the world, not metaphorically, literally. Any ship that docked in Alexandria was searched. If it had books, scrolls, or texts on board, the library took them, copied the texts, kept the originals, returned the copies, which is an extremely polite form of theft. The Ptolemies even sent agents across the Mediterranean to buy, steal, or borrow indefinitely texts from other cities. Athens, Babylon, India. If someone had written something down anywhere, Alexandria wanted it. At its peak, estimates suggest the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Not books like we imagine, scrolls, papyrus, fragile, organic, very flammable. Important detail. Keep that in the back of your mind. Now, here's the first thing people misunderstand. There wasn't one library. There were at least 2 major collections, the main library, located in the royal quarter, and the Serapeum, a secondary library attached to the Temple of Serapis. Think of it less like one building and more like a decentralized academic network, which matters a lot because it means nothing could be destroyed in one day, no matter how dramatic the fire. Now, let's address the most famous villain in this story, Julius Caesar, because somehow everything bad in ancient history eventually circles back to Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar arrived in Alexandria chasing Pompey. Pompey was already dead. Classic late arrival. Alexandria was in the middle of a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Yes, her brother. Welcome to Ptolemaic family dynamics. Caesar got involved, because of course he did. Things escalated. Fires were set in the harbor to block enemy ships, and yes, some fire spread. Ancient sources mention that warehouses containing books were burned. Important word there, warehouses, not the library itself. These were likely storage areas near the docks, holding scrolls waiting to be copied or cataloged. Did texts burn? Yes. Did a tragic amount of material get lost? Almost certainly. Did Caesar single-handedly destroy the entire library of Alexandria in a fit of Roman chaos? No, not even close. The library continued to function after Caesar. We have records of scholars working there decades later. So already the burned down in one night version is quietly falling apart. And instead of one dramatic ending, what we actually get is something far more boring. Neglect, budget cuts, political instability, and the slow realization that knowledge institutions are only useful if someone is willing to keep paying for them. The Ptolemies eventually declined, Roman rule took over, and Rome did not care about Greek scholarship the way Greek kings did. Romans liked practical knowledge, engineering, law, war. They were less interested in preserving every obscure poem ever written by a man who refused to leave his house. The library didn't vanish, it just slowly stopped being a priority.
Then came Christianity, and this part often gets exaggerated into a story of evil monks smashing scrolls while laughing maniacally, but reality, as usual, was duller. By the late Roman period, pagan institutions were losing state support. Temples closed, funding dried up. The Serapeum, which housed part of the library's collection, became a target during religious conflicts in the late 4th century CE. And in 391 CE, after escalating tensions, the Serapeum was destroyed. Was that bad for the library? Yes. Was it the final end? Probably not, because by this point, the great centralized collection was already a shadow of what it had been centuries earlier. And here's the part no one likes to hear. Most of the texts we imagine being lost forever were likely already gone. Papyrus doesn't last. Scrolls decay. Copies need copying. If a text wasn't actively being read, recopied, and taught, it didn't survive, fire or no fire. And many works simply faded out of relevance, not with a scream, but with a shrug. Now, centuries later, another story enters the chat: the Muslim conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century. And a later legend claims that the conquering caliph ordered the destruction of the library, saying something along the lines of, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous." It's a very neat quote, and it's also almost certainly fabricated centuries later. There is no contemporary evidence that such an order was given, and again, there probably wasn't a grand library left to destroy anyway. By the time Arab forces arrived, Alexandria's ancient scholarly institutions had long since declined. So what actually happened to the Library of Alexandria? It didn't burn down in one day. It didn't explode in a single tragedy. It wasn't murdered by one villain. It died the way most institutions die, slowly, quietly, over centuries, from indifference, neglect, and changing priorities. And somehow that's less satisfying, but also more human. Because the real tragedy isn't that knowledge was destroyed, it's that knowledge stopped being maintained. And that, unfortunately, is a pattern we'll be seeing again. So let's keep drifting. Next time, we'll talk about what was actually lost, what probably wasn't, and why the myth of Alexandria refuses to go away. For now, just let that thought float. One library, thousands of people, centuries of effort, not lost in a fire. Let's gently pick up where we left off. The library hasn't exploded, no single villain is twirling a mustache, and yet people are still emotionally devastated about something that mostly disappeared very slowly. Which brings us to the big question everyone always asks in a slightly panicked tone. But what knowledge did we lose? And the honest answer is, we don't fully know, which is exactly why people are obsessed with it, because mystery is always more painful than certainty. So let's talk about what was probably in the Library of Alexandria, and more importantly, what was definitely not in there, no matter how much the internet wants it to be. First, the obvious stuff. The library collected Greek literature, a lot of it: Homer, tragedies, comedies, philosophical works, and one of its main jobs was to create standardized versions of texts, because before this, literature was a mess, with different copies, edits, and endings. So scholars at Alexandria would compare versions, argue about commas for weeks, and then declare, this is the correct Homer, which is very on-brand behavior for academics. They also collected scientific works: mathematics, geometry, astronomy, medicine. Euclid taught in Alexandria, and his Elements became the foundation of geometry for over 2,000 years. Eratosthenes worked there and calculated the circumference of the Earth with shocking accuracy using shadows and math, while everyone else was just vibing. So yes, the library contained serious intellectual firepower. Now here's where people start to get carried away, with claims that it contained blueprints for steam engines, advanced medical knowledge we're only rediscovering now, proof of ancient global civilizations, electricity, or aliens. And let's lower our shoulders a bit. The library collected what existed. It didn't invent future science and then lose it. Ancient scientific knowledge had clear limits: no microscopes, no electricity grids, no industrial infrastructure. They were brilliant thinkers, not people hiding laptops. What was lost, however, was volume. Thousands of minor works, local histories, plays that didn't survive, philosophical schools that faded out, which we know because other writers reference texts that no longer exist, with lines like, as written by so-and-so in his third book, and that book is gone. That's the real loss, not magic knowledge, but texture, different viewpoints, alternative interpretations, voices that didn't make it through the copying bottleneck. Because books don't survive because they're brilliant, they survive because people keep copying them. And copying is labor, expensive labor. So over time, scribes focused on what was useful, popular, or aligned with current values, and everything else quietly disappeared. Now, let's talk about why the library myth became so dramatic. Because ancient people didn't panic about it the way modern people do. Centuries after Alexandria declined, nobody was screaming, "We lost everything." That panic shows up much later during the Renaissance, when Europe was rediscovering Greek and Roman texts, and scholars suddenly became aware of how much was missing and needed a reason. And the Library of Alexandria became the perfect symbolic scapegoat, a single place, a single loss, a single tragedy to blame. Emotionally efficient and comforting in a weird way, because it lets us believe humanity fell from a golden age into ignorance, meaning the past was smarter than us and the future could be again. But history doesn't work like that. Knowledge doesn't move in straight lines. It zigzags, stalls, relocates. And while Alexandria was declining, knowledge didn't vanish. It moved to Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad, India, China, with the Islamic Golden Age preserving and expanding Greek science through translation, commentary, improved mathematics, and advanced medicine. So when people say we lost everything in Alexandria, they're ignoring centuries of intense scholarship happening elsewhere, which is very Alexandrian of them. Now let's slow down and talk about the people who worked there, because this wasn't just an abstract institution, but a place full of very real, very stressed humans. Imagine being a scholar in Alexandria, paid by the king, given housing, food, no taxes, with a simple deal. You think, you write, you argue constantly. These people lived for intellectual beef, fighting over grammar, poetry.
Which version of a word was correct, some allegedly cursing each other in footnotes, and one librarian, Callimachus, even created one of the earliest library catalogs, listing authors, subjects, and summaries, showing the library wasn't just hoarding texts, but organizing them, which takes effort. So when funding dropped, political support faded, rulers stopped caring, the whole system slowly unraveled without any dramatic fire, just fewer scribes, less maintenance, more decay. Now let's gently address one more emotional layer. Modern people project their anxiety onto Alexandria because we live in an age where information feels fragile. Hard drives fail, websites disappear, formats become obsolete. So the idea of losing everything in one catastrophe hits a nerve, and the library becomes a warning symbol. But the irony is that its model was fragile by design, centralized, state-funded, dependent on rulers' priorities. Whereas modern knowledge survives better because it's decentralized, messy, redundant, copied everywhere. So the lesson of Alexandria isn't fire is bad, it's knowledge only survives if people keep caring. And finally, why does the idea of a single burning moment persist? Because stories need endings. A slow fade doesn't feel meaningful. Bureaucratic decline isn't cinematic, but a fire is clean and emotional and lets us point and say, there, that's when it all went wrong. Yet history almost never gives us that satisfaction. The Library of Alexandria didn't scream, it sighed, and then it stopped being noticed, which might honestly be worse. And as we drift forward, we'll zoom out even more, because Alexandria wasn't unique. Other great libraries rose and fell, and the same pattern repeats again and again.
And next time, we'll gently compare Alexandria to other lost centers of knowledge and see how often history quietly repeats itself. No flames, no villains, just time. At this point, you might be settling into that soft, half-awake state where history starts to sound like ambient noise. That's ideal. So let's gently zoom out, because one of the strangest things about the Library of Alexandria is how alone it feels in popular memory, as if it were the only place where humans ever tried to collect knowledge, as if it were the single fragile brain of the ancient world. It wasn't. Alexandria was just the most famous example of a pattern that keeps happening. Build a center of learning, pour resources into it, feel very proud, then slowly stop caring. So let's float over to a few other libraries and knowledge hubs that history tends to forget, mostly because they didn't go out with enough drama. First stop, Pergamum. Pergamum was a wealthy Hellenistic city in modern-day Turkey, and yes, they had a library, a big one. In fact, it was so impressive that it made Alexandria uncomfortable. The rulers of Pergamum wanted prestige, and prestige in this era meant scrolls, so they started collecting aggressively. Alexandria noticed, and instead of thinking, "Oh nice, more knowledge in the world," they allegedly thought, "How dare you?" According to later stories, the Ptolemies banned the export of papyrus to Pergamum to sabotage their library, which is an extremely academic form of warfare. So Pergamum adapted. They refined parchment, animal skin writing material that was more durable than papyrus, and that's likely where the word parchment comes from, Pergamum. Already we see something important. Competition between libraries didn't destroy knowledge, it expanded it. Different materials, different methods, different centers. Pergamum's library didn't burn down in a single night either. It declined when Roman priorities shifted, when funding dried up, when scholars left. Same story, different city. Now let's drift west to Rome. Rome did not start out as a knowledge-hoarding civilization. Early Romans were suspicious of Greek intellectualism, too abstract, too talky, not enough marching. But eventually, Rome realized knowledge was useful. They built libraries, public ones, and that's important. Roman libraries were often attached to baths, forums, and public spaces. You could read, then sweat, then argue about philosophy while extremely naked, a very Roman workflow. Rome had dozens of libraries at its peak, and yet we don't talk about their destruction. Why? Because there wasn't a single moment. As the Western Roman Empire declined, libraries suffered. Maintenance stopped, buildings crumbled, texts weren't recopied. Some collections survived by moving east, some didn't. Again, no explosion, just entropy. Now let's gently leave the Mediterranean, because one of the biggest blind spots in the Alexandria myth is how Eurocentric it is. While people mourn Greek scrolls, entire non-European traditions are quietly ignored. So let's talk about Nalanda. Nalanda was a massive Buddhist monastic university in India, founded around the 5th century CE. It had thousands of students, dormitories, lecture halls, and yes, a library, actually 3 large library buildings. They contained religious texts, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and logic. And here's the part that always shows up online. Nalanda was destroyed violently, invaded in the 12th century, buildings burned, texts lost. People love to point to this and say, see, libraries do burn down in one day. But even here, the story is more complicated. Nalanda had already been in decline. Funding had weakened, political support had shifted. The invasion was devastating, yes, but it hit something that was already fragile, just like Alexandria. Violence accelerates decline. It rarely creates it from nothing. Now let's move east again, to China. China had massive archives, imperial libraries, state records, and here's something fascinating. Chinese history records multiple intentional destructions of texts ordered by the state itself. The most famous is the Qin dynasty's book burnings in the 3rd century BCE. The emperor wanted ideological control, so books were destroyed. And yet, Chinese knowledge didn't vanish. Scholars memorized texts, copied them privately, passed them down orally. So even deliberate destruction didn't erase everything, which tells us something important.
Knowledge survival isn't just about buildings, it's about people. Now let's bring this gently back to Alexandria. By now, a pattern should be emerging. Libraries don't usually die from one event. They die when political support fades, funding stops, scholars leave, copying slows, and maintenance fails. Fire is just the flashy part people remember. The real killer is boredom and indifference. Now let's talk about why Alexandria specifically became the symbol. Because it wasn't just a library, it was an idea. Alexandria represented the belief that knowledge could be centralized, collected, and controlled. One place, one system, one master archive. That idea is deeply appealing. It feels safe, but it's also fragile. When that one place weakens, everything attached to it feels threatened. And that's why modern people feel anxious about Alexandria. It mirrors our own fears. Cloud storage, servers, data centers. We say everything is backed up, but emotionally, we still imagine one building holding it all and losing it. So we turn Alexandria into a cautionary tale. But the truth is quieter. Knowledge didn't disappear, it redistributed. Scrolls were copied in monasteries, translated in Baghdad, preserved in Byzantium. And yes, much was lost, but much also survived precisely because it left Alexandria. So here's a slightly uncomfortable thought to drift off with. If the Library of Alexandria had stayed perfectly intact forever, if it had remained the sole center of learning, that might have been worse. Because monopolies, even intellectual ones, don't age well. The messiness of history is what saved knowledge. Multiple centers, multiple copies, multiple traditions, no single point of failure. So when people mourn Alexandria, they're really mourning an idea. The idea that there was once a perfect place where everything made sense. History rarely offers that. It offers fragments, footnotes, translations, errors, and somehow that's enough. Next time, we'll drift into the people who romanticized Alexandria the most: Renaissance scholars, modern historians, and internet myth-makers, and why we keep rebuilding the library in our imagination, even though it never really existed the way we think. If your eyes are heavy and your thoughts are drifting, then you're exactly where this story wants you to be. We can finish it slowly and softly, without trying to wake the library back up again. By now, something slightly disappointing but necessary has already happened. The Library of Alexandria has been taken off its flaming pedestal. There was no single inferno, no final scream of knowledge, no moment where humanity collectively became dumber overnight. And yet, the library did not simply vanish. In a strange way, it became more powerful after it was gone, because Alexandria gained something more durable than papyrus. It became a symbol, and symbols are almost impossible to destroy. As centuries passed and the Renaissance arrived, Europe began rediscovering ancient texts: Greek philosophy, Roman history, mathematics, medicine. Scholars were excited but also deeply frustrated, because for every text they found, they could sense many more that were missing. References existed without originals, quotations without sources, names without surviving works. In moments like this, humans imagine a golden age, a time when everything was known, organized, and complete before it was all lost. Alexandria became the emotional container for that loss.
It stopped being just a library and became the library, the place where all answers once lived before ignorance took over and things went wrong. That idea was comforting because it suggested knowledge had been stolen, not slowly neglected, selectively forgotten, or deprioritized through countless small decisions. And if it was stolen, then in theory it could be recovered. In the modern era, despite living in a world of infinite articles, videos, and opinions, people feel less certain than ever. Once again, Alexandria is summoned. People say things like, if the Library of Alexandria hadn't burned, we'd be on Mars by now. It's a lovely thought, but also deeply optimistic, because knowledge alone does not change the world. Infrastructure does. Politics does. Economics does. Alexandria did not fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it depended on rulers who eventually stopped caring. That is the quiet lesson most people skip. It is also easy to talk about scrolls and much harder to imagine the people. The scholars of Alexandria were human beings who woke up each day believing their job was to understand the universe. Some were brilliant, some were wrong about almost everything, and some were probably unbearable to talk to. They argued about grammar while empires shifted around them, and debated star charts while political power slowly moved elsewhere. And eventually they left. Not all at once and not dramatically. They followed funding, students, and stability. Knowledge did not die, it migrated. That part of the story feels unsatisfactory because migration doesn't feel like a tragedy. It feels administrative. There is a final irony in all of this. The Library of Alexandria is often blamed for losing knowledge, but its existence may have saved more than we realize. By centralizing texts, it helped create authoritative versions that were copied, distributed, and referenced long after the institution declined. In that sense, the library did not fail, it simply stopped being needed in that form. It is not a dramatic ending, but it is a very human one. History rarely ends with meaning. More often, it ends with a budget meeting no one attends. So the myth can finally be set down gently. The Library of Alexandria did not burn down in a single day. It did not take all human knowledge with it, and it was not the single hinge on which civilization turned. It was an ambitious experiment, and like many ambitious experiments, it worked for a while. Then conditions changed, and the world moved on. If anything, its real legacy is not what was lost, but what was learned about how knowledge survives best. Not in one place, not under one ruler, but scattered, copied, redundant, imperfect, and alive.